Hello, my name is Victoria Bazzi, and I'm here with
James announced.
Untaha Mion.
Symphony Trailer.
And this is the Unfrauen podcast. Today we're opening a conversation up on A Crystal Ball, how Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, foretells the world of 2023.
In this podcast, we will be discussing how the violation of Article 7 from the Declaration of Human Rights, which states, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination, was predicted by Margaret Atwood in The Handmaid's Tale. So, let the games begin. Wait, that's from a different dystopian novel.
So, Symphony, what were your thoughts on how Article 7 was violated?
In The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood's effective use of allusion through Offred's dialogue emphasizes the violation of Article 7 through the lack of control that women have in Gilead. From the beginning, we're introduced to Offred's literary references with Hans Christian Andersen's Red Shoes on page 8. Offred recalls, I get up out of the chair, advance my feet into the sunlight, in their red shoes, flat-heeled to save the spine and not for dancing. The significance of this reference comes in through the main character of Red Shoes, Karen, a young girl who is forced to dance in red shoes even post-amputation until an angel comes in as her saving grace. In this work, Andersen has themes of objectification and exploitation, specifically towards women, which Atwood shares throughout the entirety of The Handmaid's Tale. Additionally, an angel coming to Karen's rescue can be tied to the idea of escape in Gilead, which was previously revealed in class as suicide. Along with this, Gilead is heavily religious, so the angel symbolism doubles as a reference to Offred's newfound religious beliefs.
Thank you, Symphony, for those interesting points. Now, James, how was characterization used in The Handmaid's Tale to display the violations of Article 7?
On pages 71 and 72 of The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood has Aunt Helena leading a group of women in the act of discriminating Janine for something that was by no means her fault. It's Janine telling about how she was gang raped at 14 and had an abortion. She told the same story last week. She seemed almost proud of it. But whose fault was it? Aunt Helena says. Her fault, her fault, her fault, we chant in unison. Who led them on? Aunt Helena beams, pleased with us. She did. Why did God allow for such a terrible thing to happen? Teach her a lesson, teach her a lesson, teach her a lesson. This act of the characters making fun of and blaming Janine for what had happened to her, as well as characterizing her as someone who leads men on and was just taught a lesson as a result of that, it shows that Article 7 was directly gone against. And the article says that all are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination, showing that it in fact was violated.
Okay, let's take a quick break to address our first sponsor of this podcast. This ad is brought to you by the Handmaid's Tale television show on Hulu, where the first few seasons are great, and then go off the rails and just get downright weird because of the lack of material, but makes a comeback at the end because Atwood published another book, so they finally had something to go off of. Yeah, I don't think we're getting another sponsorship from Hulu again.
Thank you, Hulu, for sponsoring us today. But now let's get back to it. Muntaha, how did Atwood decide to show the violations of Article 7 in The Handmaid's Tale using symbolism?
Yeah, of course. So I decided to tackle the symbolism in my annotation. So I first wanted to look specifically at the quote on page 33, when Offred and Ofcom are taking their daily walk and pass by the wall, where they see the doctors who had been executed because they had performed abortions during the pre-Gilead era. So here's the quote. I look at the one red smile. The red of the smile is the same as the red of the tulips in Serena Joy's garden. Now, throughout the book, tulips have symbolized, or flowers in general have symbolized fertility. And that is the same case here. The tulips symbolize fertility, and the doctor's red smile signify their gruesome death. So this simile of the red smiles and tulips conveys how the doctors who had performed abortions had, in a sense, contributed to the infertility issue in Gilead, in Gilead's eyes and viewpoint. And because of this, they were hanged because, as Offred put it, No woman in her right mind these days would have sought to prevent a birth, page 33. This goes against Article 7 of the Declaration of Human Rights because of the acts of violence that were committed against doctors who had performed abortions. They were not protected under the law even when they had committed the acts before the creation of Gilead. Additionally, the women in Gilead were indirectly discriminated against in this specific situation because if the doctors who perform abortions are being killed off, this limits the woman's ability to have abortions, therefore leading to the discrimination against women because their reproductive rights are being taken away, and they have no choice but to give birth even if they are at risk themselves. Now, coming back to reality, we see this happening in America in 2023. Okay, maybe not doctors being murdered for performing abortions, but women lacking access to abortions due to new laws set by the states. An example of this is like how Roe v. Wade was recently overturned, which limited women's reproductive rights, and this is very similar to how Atwood had predicted/conveyed in her novel.
To add to that, I believe the symbolism that you point out, Muntaha, and the illusions that Atwood includes in this work go hand in hand. You talk about how doctors who performed abortions were killed off, and I can only assume that you found that through Alfred's description of the wall on page 32, which states, each has a placard hung around his neck to show why he had been executed, a drawing of a human fetus. They were doctors, then, in the time before, when such things were legal. Angel makers, they used to call them, or was that something else? I specifically want to dive into the angel makers term that she uses. Angel makers were European women, typically Swedish, that adopted unwanted babies in the early 1900s. Sadly, most of the babies ended up dying from neglect and abandonment. Furthermore, Gilead's lack of children caused them to view children as gifts from God, which is why they take the prevention of abortions and pregnancy loss extremely seriously. There is a fear that the lack of children will prevent the continuation of Gilead after death takes its toll. For this reason, Atwood's clear allusion to angel makers is to draw a comparison between them and the doctors through the eyes of the people in power in Gilead, where the doctors are viewed as greedy baby murderers who promote child abuse and neglect.
Atwood also includes visual imagery to show how Article 7 was violated. On page 32, Atwood uses lots of gruesome visual imagery to display the doctors being hung. Atwood states, though if you look and look as we are doing, you can see the outlines of the features under the white cloth, like gray shadows. The heads are the heads of snowmen, with the coal eyes and the carrot noses falling off. The heads are melting. The visual imagery of the doctors being like snowmen shows how they were portrayed as being cold and heartless for performing the abortions, while dehumanizing the doctors who are now dead. However, snowmen are usually created by children, which shows their pure intentions. Also, the visual imagery of these snowman doctors being deformed and melting makes it creepy and gives the message that these are bad people and this is what happens if they don't obey the new society's ways. Also, the symbolism of the carrot noses falling off shows the secret of performing the abortions being revealed. This is because carrots are grown underground, hidden, and the abortions were performed secretly. However, now the carrots have fallen off, representing the doctor's secrets being revealed. This clearly shows the violations of Article 7, since those doctors should have been protected under the law, but instead they were displayed to scare anyone else from standing up for what they believe in. And although today in our society a doctor would not be killed for performing an abortion, they are still at risk for losing their job and facing discrimination from others.
On to our second sponsor for the podcast, Cal-Maine Foods, the largest egg producers in the United States. Ironically, also known as Calm, something that is non-existent in the world of Gilead.
That was extremely enlightening analysis from Victoria there. And while we're on the topic of calmness in Gilead, or lack thereof, Alfred alludes to a play from 1622, The Changeling, on page 9, where she describes a sister dipped in blood. In The Changeling, sister refers to a virgin who had convinced her servant to murder her husband and was now being forced to have sex with said husband as punishment for her crimes. Once again, Atwood's blatant use of Alfred's dialogue to refer to media surrounding oppressed women highlights how Gilead has stripped women of their bodily autonomy. While it may seem outrageous to think of the society we have today morphing into something as severe as Gilead, it's important that we acknowledge how women around the United States are now facing a similar stripping of their autonomy that the sister and the changeling and the handmaids in the Handmaid's Tale were subject to through the reversal of Roe v. Wade. The reversal of Roe v. Wade has sparked controversy throughout the United States, with people arguing that since the Supreme Court is male dominated, they should not have a say on what women choose to do with their bodies. Alternatively, Gilead leaves no room for backlash of this nature, revealing another similarity between The Handmaid's Tale and The Changeling.
Also, at the very beginning of the book, visual imagery is used once again as Ovid vividly describes the Red Center. The Red Center is where the handmaids are trained. The location of this center is in what had once been a high school gymnasium. She describes the setting with the now antiqued games and the light smell of gum and sweat. When she describes this specific scent, she uses olfactory imagery, as the scent of gum and sweat triggers memories from before Gilead was formed. Also, Atwood's choice to use the specific scent of gum shows how she was feeling stuck there and feeling chewed up, just like how a piece of chewed up gum can be stuck on the floor or under a table. Also, the scent of sweat represents the feeling of guilt, as Offit feels guilt for leaving her family behind, although she had no choice. The setting that she so vividly describes is ironic, since they are located in a school, yet the women in Gilead are not allowed to read or learn anything but the society standards. They are forced to go back to old fashioned ways in a more modern setting. This clearly violates Article 7, since the women have lost their ability to make choices and are very harshly discriminated against. This compares to today's society because although the conditions aren't nearly as extreme, losing the ability to be able to have an abortion still takes away women's choices with what they do with their own body.
Characterization is fairly used on page 26 of The Handmaid's Tale when the women are talking about someone who is pregnant. At first, the women are just wanting to know who the person's name was, but then they switch to characterizing the pregnant woman as a show-off and someone who is lucky, especially in this quote from The Handmaid's Tale. Show-off, a voice hisses, and this is true. A woman that is pregnant doesn't have to go out, doesn't have to go shopping. The daily walk is no longer prescribed to keep her abdominal muscles in working order. She could stay at her house, and it's dangerous for her to be out. Now that she is the carrier of life, she is closer to death. Jealousy could get her. It's happened before. All children are wanted now, but not by everyone. This quote shows that pregnant women in Gilead don't need to do as much as they normally would so that the baby is unharmed, which leads to the other women characterizing them as show-offs and as lucky. But the quote also says that now that she is the carrier of life, she is closer to death. This stands out because it shouldn't be that case if they are protected more than usual and have to do less than they normally would. It is later found out that this is due to the ban on using technology to look at the baby and to see if there are any issues that are present. It is later said that whatever it is must be carried to the term. This shows that no matter the risk caused to the baby must be born, and there can be no help provided by technology such as an abortion in the event of choosing between the life of the baby or the woman who is having the baby. Because in Gilead, the baby is the most important thing. The baby, this ban on being able to use technology to do things such as abortions relates to the event of the overturn of Roe v. Wade, as doctors are now no longer able to perform abortions in real life, even if the person doesn't want the child or is going to be injured or even killed as a result of it.
Interesting perspective, James. Again, we're introduced to how these literary devices connect to each other. As the story goes on, though it doesn't take long for Atwood to introduce these elements of the plot, it becomes easier to see how used to Gilead Alfred is becoming. On page 61, Alfred significantly says, "Give me children or else I die." Here, Atwood is using a quote from the Old Testament story of Rachel in the Bible, who is telling her husband to impregnate the maid so that she can claim the child. As I mentioned earlier, Roe v. Wade was overturned, and while that is an important thing to cover, what is more relatable to The Handmaid's Tale is why it was questioned in the first place. Roe v. Wade was questioned based on religious beliefs, like those read in Gilead. Rachel's story in the Bible follows her feeling disgraced by God since she is not able to bear children. Atwood's obvious use of this biblical knowledge is to make a connection between the two texts where women feel like they must have children under the guise of religious duty and guilt.
And that wraps up today's conversation on A Crystal Ball, how Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, tells the world of 2023.